state officials feared that a wastewater pond could collapse at any time, spewing millions of gallons of contaminated water into residential areas and Tampa Bay. Our correspondent John Huddy has more.
Florida Governor Ron DeSantis declared a state of emergency in Manatee County as crews worked around the clock to try and stop a catastrophe from happening. A portion of the containment reservoir wall located at the former Piney Point phosphate processing plant has a, quote, significant leak, according to state officials, with the possibility of the wall collapsing and then sending a 20-foot wall of contaminated water gushing out, roughly 2 miles from the shores of Tampa Bay. The Manatee County Public Safety Department sent out emergency evacuation notices Friday for hundreds of residents living within a half-mile of Piney Point. And by 11 a.m. Saturday, evacuation orders extended to people within a mile north of the reservoir stacks of phosphogypsum, a fertilizer waste product. The water leaking out is a mix of salt water, processed wastewater, and storm runoff. State officials say the water is not radioactive, but a total breach that sends a wall of water gushing out uncontrollably could destabilize gypsum stacks that do contain radioactive material. Crews are pumping out about 36 million gallons of wastewater per day from the reservoir, but there remains roughly 250 million gallons in the reservoir left. That said, the water level does continue to drop, so that's some good news at least. The Florida Department of Environmental Quality and Florida National Guard have sent massive pumps to the containment walls to aid in the emergency efforts. In the meantime, the Manatee County Sheriff's Office moved 345 inmates from the county jail to another location as a precautionary measure as well. The Florida DEP says the area's groundwater has not been contaminated and the county's drinking water is safe. But there remains concern about potential runoff into Tampa Bay and the long-term environmental effects as the race against time to contain what could become an environmental catastrophe continues. For RT, John Huddy.
And joining us to discuss is Associate Attorney at Levin, Papantonio and Rafferty, is Sarah Papantonio. Sarah, thanks for joining us today. First, I got to ask you, as both an attorney and a resident of Florida, how concerned are you about this imminent threat of wastewater to the local habitat?
It's extremely concerning, but it's shocking that it's even gotten to this point. You know, at this point, it's no longer a threat, an imminent threat. This is a problem. It's happening. They're dumping 70 million gallons of toxic waste into the Tampa Bay every day to try to relieve pressure on this plant. But what's even more concerning in this situation is that the company responsible for this, as well as Florida regulatory agencies, continue to act like dumping this water into the Tampa Bay, into these waterways, is no big deal, that it poses no threat to the citizens of the Tampa Bay area. And that is absolutely false. Because understand, what they're dumping into the water contains high levels of phosphates, of nitrates. And not only that, this water is sitting on a radioactive mound. But yet, if you ask the Florida Department of Environmental Protection or any of our representatives, they'll tell you it is no big deal, and that is completely false. And that is what is making this scenario so alarming to myself as well as other residents in Florida.
Now, a little bit of history to the plant here. The plant was originally built back in 1966, and since then the owners have changed hands repeatedly, and the plant has come under some scrutiny over the years over allegations of fumes that have sickened workers, have killed local wildlife, and even cattle belonging to nearby farmers. The phosphorite fumes are this chemical waste from producing fertilizer, right? So the U.S. is actually the world's third largest offender here. But the country isn't likely to stop using fertilizer. So what's the alternative to just pooling the waste as we do?
Right, and that's a fundamental problem. But the true crux of this problem right here is the fact that this company knew for over a year that this structure was on the verge of collapse. You know, the company predicted this very moment was going to happen. It is well documented in inspection reports. They simply knew that this millions of gallons, hundreds of millions of gallons of toxic waste was potentially going to leak into residential areas. But yet they just allowed it to get to this point. You know, like we said, this company's got a history. They've got a rap sheet. And so we're going to continue to pull this phosphate, but if we have to hold these companies responsible, we cannot allow a company to not do so safely, because now you see hundreds of people are at risk of this contamination.
Yeah, and this isn't just a Piney Point or Manatee County problem, right? There are 27 phosphogypsum stacks all over the state of Florida.
That's correct. Florida has 80% of the phosphate plants in the United States. And so if we allow companies like this to come in and just completely mismanage this industry, then it's going to have a lasting effect on this state. I mean, this state will turn into a wasteland, a toxic wasteland, if we allow the same behavior to happen across the state.
All right, that's actually a clip of, I think that was 2 days ago, from RT America about a situation that's going on in Tampa. I often hear people talk about late stage capitalism, capitalism's decline. And Tampa is not the only place with undrinkable water. Definitely there's Flint. And we can go on, but we have a packed house tonight. We have an extra co-host for tonight. The guest tonight, I do want to say, is someone, I feel like I can call him a friend. He wrote a book for Zero Books a couple years ago called Welcome to the Rebellion. It's about Star Wars. If you know anything about me and this show, I love Star Wars, maybe a little too much. And then he had told me, he was writing a new book using the Hunger Games to talk about the decline of capitalism. And his Star Wars book is not a fan fiction or anything like that. It's actually using Star Wars as a grand narrative for the left. But before I bring on our guest, let me first bring on my co-host, my homie, my dog, Pascal Robert.
Peace and greetings, Comrade Jason.
Some people in the chat saw us this morning on Left Flank Vets, and someone said butter pecan is Jason's favorite ice cream flavor.
We don't want to relive that.
And I had the wrong link initially up for the patron-only bonus part that comes after this. I apologize, and I truly appreciate everybody's patience with me to get the right link up. Thank you guys very much. We have a special guest host for today that's also a pop culture aficionado. You may know him as our foreign policy man on the street. He's got the longest last name that's unpronounceable in the known universe. He's Polish. He's a badass. He's Kuba.
The pleasure is mine. And if you think about it, Kuba unpronounceable is kind of a Star Wars name, right? Like, I think one of the creeps in the back at the Mos Eisley Cantina. But yeah, it's a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to getting my nerd on.
Now, without any further ado, this man, I enjoy his books. I got really excited. I was kind of bopping around the apartment when he first had sent me the PDF of his latest book, Stay Alive. I was like, oh, I'm a special person because I got the PDF. I feel so special. You may know him as a writer for Zero Books. We know him as Dr. Michael Harris.
Good morning, good evening. Good to be with you.
It is morning where you are. Are we allowed to say where you are? Or is it top secret?
It's not top secret at all. I'm in Chiang Mai in northern Thailand.
So thank you for waking up early and coming on the show. I feel like the first time I ever did this live stream shit, I did it with Dr. Harris and economist Arash Kalahi, and we were talking about Welcome to the Rebellion. You can definitely find it in the archives. So it's exciting to bring him on as the show has grown such leaps and bounds. So thank you again for coming on, Dr. Harris.
You're more than welcome, sir.
So what came first, your idea to write about declining civilizations, or you watching Hunger Games and thinking, I got it? I'm gonna write
Declining
that.
civilizations. I was never a big Hunger Games fan. You know, generationally, I'm Star Wars really, and that's where the previous book came out of. And I was thinking about young people and the importance of political hope and the importance of, as you say, grand narratives on the left. And then in thinking about a new book, I thought, well, what are the stories which really resonate with young people today? Obviously, there are young Star Wars fans, but what are the stories, the big pop culture phenomena that have really spoken to young people? And I started thinking about the Hunger Games, and I rewatched the films and then read the books, which I hadn't done before, and just saw a lot in there in terms of metaphor and circumstances that I thought addressed the issue of living in collapse rather than thinking forward to collapse, thinking about what left politics means in a situation where we recognize that collapse and dystopia is already here, particularly for some people. So that's kind of how the latest book started.
Kuba, did you have a question for Dr. Harris?
Yeah, actually. So I read Stay Alive, and I didn't read the Hunger Games books, but I saw the movies when they came out. I thought they were very cool. Panem, you know, the name of the dystopia playing on Panem circuses. I thought that was very clever. I appreciate it. And you're right. It's a rich story. It's rich in terms of political resonance. I'm curious to what extent you think that they're telling a specific story about the United States, because Panem is a successor state to the US. It's a very American dystopia in a lot of ways. The tension between the capital and the districts, that plays into things like federalism, that plays into the relationship between the American metropolis, whether we're talking about kind of the metropolis in general, or New York, or Washington, D.C., and the hinterland, deindustrialization, things like that. And there are a lot of characteristics that are particular to the United States in terms of the trajectory of Panem. But in the book, you also tease out global lessons. You touch on leftist movements, protest movements all over the world. Your forward begins in Hong Kong, and the fact that there's going to be a theme park version of the Hunger Games in the PRC. So, to what extent do you think that we've got a story about politics in general, or a universal trajectory, versus something that's specific to the United States?
I think it's you're the expert on pop culture, but you can see the resonance of it in the way that the Hunger Games, the symbols from the Hunger Games and some of the phrases and so on have been used in protests over the past few years in places like Hong Kong, here in Thailand, Myanmar. It's being used at the moment, a 3-finger salute of solidarity, Chile, Colombia. You know, clearly it's having a resonance, has had a resonance for young people across the world, albeit in very different cultural and political circumstances. But essentially what unites all of those movements is an anger at inequalities, a lack of hope, elite corruption, a sense of the immovability of political elites, disinformation, the sense of pressure on young people, that they're meant to perform in certain ways in our capitalist system, and with social media now on them as well. So clearly Suzanne Collins, the writer of the Hunger Games, set the story in, as you say, a post-collapse United States. She didn't have to do that, and so she was addressing things she saw in American politics and culture, and I would say political economy as well. But it's also had a much broader resonance for young people feeling some of the same pressures, and I would say the same traumas in lots of countries around the world.
And I know Pascal had some questions for you as well.
Yeah, I had a question for Dr. Harris. One of the things, a common trait that we see on the left is a critique of film and culture in Hollywood through an analysis of how these types of cultural productions reify capitalism. What I find fascinating about your work is that you're taking obviously capitalist Hollywood productions and using their narratives to actually subvert the function of capitalism. How exactly do you go through that process to find those kind of themes that are most effective at kind of challenging the main overall functionality of capitalism in an actual capitalist product?
Well, this was one of the debates about the Hunger Games from the start, of course. You know, the criticism that, well, it's Hollywood again selling us rebeltainment. You know, this is very superficial, and obviously you can take these big popular culture stories in any ways you want. But the more, I surprised myself actually. The more I kind of looked into the story and the themes that were being addressed, I thought there's something here. There's a framework where we can talk about capitalism and collapse, in particular, crisis and collapse, which is something I want to talk more about. I mean, Mark Fisher, I quote in the book as saying, you know, in a way, we need to be like the rebels in the story. Once we've been offered up some of these symbols, even if we think they're superficial or just Hollywood kind of versions of revolutions, we can take some of these symbols and themes and run with them and appropriate them. And it's interesting how that echoes some of the story in particular the second and third books in the Hunger Games series, where it's very much about playing with symbols of revolution and propaganda and how, in particular, the organized revolution which emerges in the Hunger Games story, you know, is very conscious about using symbols in order to take the revolution to a fuller stage and eventually overturn the existing regime. So you know, I think we can get hung up on what the author actually intended and sometimes miss out on how these popular culture stories are a way into talking about politics and political economy and protest and revolution for audiences that they obviously resonate with. So let's, you know, I think kind of let's use them as best we can.
I just wanted to read this part of the book. This is actually from the introduction. And also Dr. Harris and I did a show maybe 2 or 3 months back about this book. So if you want to go back and listen to that, it's just the audio only podcast. So I like this version better because now people, if they have questions for him, you can ask him now. But in the introduction, Dr. Harris writes, "The Hunger Games isn't just the brutally honest name of the annual fight to the death competition organized by the Capitol, the city that dominates Panem. It's the way that its elite controls the districts, starvation, scarcity, and minimal rewards doled out to subservient districts. The Capitol uses hunger as a weapon against the masses. It's also a powerful metaphor for the economic system we live under today, so much so that the Hunger Games has now become shorthand for any especially brutally competitive environment or economy." So Kuba wants to add something to this. Go for it, Kuba.
So I think that's an excellent point. And one thing that you notice, can you hear me now?
I can hear you fine.
Okay, great. The one of the characteristics of Panem and of the sort of Hunger Games that you, the literal Hunger Games and the Hunger Games as metaphor that you set up, is a kind of abandonment of development, an abandonment of optimism, and instead the management of scarcity, but not of a natural scarcity, of an artificial scarcity. If you think about it, this post-apocalyptic Panem has got vast areas that are relatively uninhabited. It has advanced technology that could be used to develop the coal mining industry, so people didn't have this backbreaking labor. It would be possible for the capital, if it were so inclined, to create enlarge the size of the pie, even if it insisted on maintaining an unequal distribution of goods. But what you have in Panem is this frozen scarcity, this frozen collapse, that we're just going to have scarcity forever, but for them, not for us. And this will be one of the levers we use to maintain power. When you look at contemporary political economy, it feels a lot like the United States in particular has just given up on the future. The clip that Jason showed of the phosphate waste pool just bleeding into the water supply in Florida, that story can be repeated in every state time and time again. Collapsing infrastructure, the very fact that the United States still relies on bridges, roads, infrastructure, physical systems that are 2 or 3 generations old.
Yeah, I was gonna say antiquated infrastructure that's just now getting a reboot.
Exactly, maybe, perhaps, right? Like,
not even a reboot, like a mending, if you will. Yeah,
they've started writing the screenplay for the reboot, but we'll see if it even makes it into production. And but that's not inevitable. That's a choice. If you think about some other countries and the way that they're coping, the People's Republic of China is one example, but Japan, places like Dubai, Scandinavian countries are making investments, are looking at promising technologies, are thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead rather than simply accepting this status quo as the perpetual normal present forever. So I guess my question is, you have the quote, the sort of classic quote by William Gibson, that the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. Could we also say that collapse, and that's the gist that you have, collapse is already here, it's unevenly distributed, and similarly capacity, right? Hope, possibility is here, it's just unevenly distributed. There's some places that have the physical and social and human infrastructure in place to maybe build a future for themselves, and others where it's going to be the Hunger Games 70. There are going to be more Hunger Games than Super Bowls pretty soon.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think it goes back to your first question about to what extent the Hunger Games is about the United States specifically, or it's kind of more global in its themes. One of the things we don't find out about in the book is what's happened to the rest of the world. So it's entirely possible that there are countries in this fictional universe that actually have coped with crisis, ecological crisis, economic crisis, in a much more successful way, but those aren't referenced. And the United States, or Pan Am in this version, is a very kind of closed society, and the media is controlled. So perhaps that's a reason that the residents of Pan Am don't hear about the rest of the world. It's really, I think it's both a manufactured scarcity, but it's also a real scarcity in the first instance. And this goes back to the importance of talking about collapse and thinking about a left politics as if we're in the early stages of collapse already, and actually have been for some time, because there is real scarcity here. We will, in all likelihood, experience a major crisis in the food production system, in part because of climate change and ecological disaster. We've had a kind of dry run, as it were, in the pandemic, but this is the future that we're going to increasingly experience, future pandemics, economic crisis, because we're not set up to deal with kind of waves of crisis coming at us. And so there's a real basis to this in terms of scarcity, but then of course regimes can find different ways to respond to that scarcity. One of the points Mark Fisher actually makes, I think, very usefully about the Hunger Games world is that there's a future for the capital. The capital is living in the future. It's only the districts that are contained within this kind of structured, contained class and the past. And so when Katniss, is taken from her district 12, which is a very rural coal mining district, into the capital city that runs Pan Am, she's amazed. She's never really seen just how futuristic and advanced that capital is, and how society could be. And clearly that's hoarded by that elite class. And so you have these kind of two futures going on, this immiserated future in enforced scarcity, and then a very celebrity-oriented kind of creative class type future in the capital city. So they haven't given up on their own future, but they've definitely enforced a kind of more primitive past on the rest of the population in order to contain them.
It's funny you say that, because there is something about the capital, the fact that it's the circuses part of the bread and circuses. It's advanced, it's prosperous, it's rich, there's high technology, but what are they doing with all of this? They're not colonizing the moon, they're not curing cancer, they're not modernizing the planet, they're not conquering Canada. There's this type of stagnation at the top that reflects the scarcity at the bottom. If it's not a scarcity of resources, it's a scarcity of imagination. Like that, this is all that there can be, and the only conflict, or the only future, the only dynamic of history is keeping this for ourselves and preventing the districts from getting their part of it.
Yeah, it's a royal court. Someone described the capital as a kind of royal court, and that's what it is. They're obsessed by trivia, celebrity. They're the only ones really who are invested in the Hunger Games. One of the things I like about the story is that most of the districts, apart from a few of those that are kind of more bought off by the capital deliberately, in the way that the system is engineered, they get a few more rewards. But most of the districts, despise the Hunger Games. They're not caught up in them, and that's quite different actually from the view of the masses you get in some superficially similar stories where there's some advanced, brutal future sport. The masses are depicted as, being completely indoctrinated, bought into the violent future sport as spectators, cheering along. That isn't the case in the Hunger Games. In most of the outlying districts, they are resigned in many ways, passive, beaten down, starving, but they're not fans of the celebrity and the brutality. They are disdainful of it. It's something they just endure. The class that are caught up in it are the elites, and I think there's an interesting echo there about how political elites in our world are the ones that consume the cable TV news, the political, so-called political news, as political entertainment, and deal with politics mainly in terms of celebrity, who's up, who's down, and gossip and so on. But the districts actually are just kind of trying to get on with their lives and survive in that context.
And Pascal, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I wanted to play off of one of the questions Cuba had about technology and how in Hunger Games, it doesn't seem like the elites of Panama are interested in an advancement, and it demonstrates a certain decay. But I think it's interesting in our current society, we have technology, like people like Elon Musk talking about escaping Mars or escaping to outer space. And we have artificial intelligence talking about displacing labor. How do you see the role of technology in our contemporary society differentiating from utility in Panama and the Hunger, yet still creating that same kind of dystopian differentiation between the elites and the majority of the proletariat?
Well, it's interesting. I'm thinking about this a lot because my next book is about dystopias and technological solutionism, by which I mean people who look to technology to solve all of our problems without thinking about the political and social changes you need in order to harness technology for the greater good. So, I mean, Elon Musk and so on is a classic example of that. Never mind so much about the planet. We'll just leave the planet. This is kind of right-wing libertarian fantasy, and of course we won't be leaving the planet. It will be Elon Musk leaving the planet for a dome on Mars, and saving himself and his fellow libertarians. So I'm increasingly critical of this technologism, which says if we can only harness the full power of these technologies, we won't have to make the more radical social and political and cultural changes that we need to make in order to respond to some of these crises. I'm not sure that answers your question, Pascal. So if you want to have another go at it, please do.
It is interesting. This technology question is interesting because now that I'm thinking about it, I'm seeing people in the chat talk about the only thing that grows in capitalism is inequality. They're in high-speed rail. Like they make a big when they get the kids from when they pick the kids for the District 12, which is supposed to be the super impoverished district, right? And as you find out, District 1 is the well-to-do district where they pick kids at grade school age and train them for years on how to fight this thing. The first thing they do is they get on high-speed rail and they're bragging about, oh, this is 200 miles an hour. You're kind of like, oh my God, they have high-speed rail, but this girl is literally trading squirrels for bread.
Yeah, and it's one of the remarkable things about District 12 and the squirrels for bread is, and Dr. Harris pointed this out in the book, District 12 is Appalachia. And the technological inequality in the Hunger Games is not that far from the gap between the most impoverished parts of Appalachia and poor parts of the United States. Those high-speed trains already exist. They just don't go to even in a rich country like the United States. You just don't go to the poor places, the poor parts of town.
Well, that's how even our subway system here in Cuba. You were a student here in the Bay Area, as well. BART, doesn't it was originally designed to actually go through nicer areas like the peninsula of California or the Bay Area, and it doesn't. It's like, nope, we cut you people off because we don't want you people into this nice part of town.
So, and this is that's a great point, right? There's an entire municipal politics of inequality that goes along with mass transit, and one way, and what typically happens in places where municipal governments get elected, right? Like you've got rich people, they have disproportionate influence. You end up protecting or conserving those areas from mass transit because it's kind of this NIMBY, let's keep the riffraff out kind of thing. And for a long time, that was the case in Vancouver too. You couldn't take the metro, you can take the SkyTrain to UBC.
Well, now the SkyTrains charge you too.
Oh, well, the SkyTrain was you always paid for the SkyTrain, but like you couldn't take it to UBC because it was going through a rich neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And I feel horrible that I'm gonna need to verify this, but my understanding is that for the Olympics, it's like, I'm sorry, we know you have a nice area, but we have to push it through.
It's got to go to East Vancouver.
Exactly. Like, we got to connect you to the network, right? And there's these moments where state autonomy can, the state can veto an elite obstruction. And it depends on a very particular kind of state and a very particular set of conditions. But that's one way of breaking the stranglehold between, the contradiction between the potential of technology and its use for exploitation and control. If you have the right kind of institution, it can push through to a broader, more egalitarian outcome.
Did you want to say something, Pascal?
I have a question I want to ask. Might seem kind of controversial, but how much does the racialization of poverty in America stop the realization that we actually will be coming to a Hunger Games reality? In other words, if the people who are the peasants in Hunger Games are thought to be basically black and brown, wouldn't that preclude most Americans from even realizing we're going to that direction?
Yeah, I mean the system in the Hunger Games is very much a managed authoritarian capitalism, and and what comes through sometimes quite subtly in the books is just how carefully it's managed, and one of those is clearly it's managed in racial terms. There's a kind of interesting superficial liberalism to the capital. Actually, it's quite diverse and it's very kind of funky in its fashions and so on. But then there are areas which are clearly predominantly black areas, which are the most immiserated, and there's a very strong emphasis on punishment of those areas through the Hunger Games competition itself, but more generally in terms of how resources are doled out. Some right-wing libertarians like to think about the Hunger Games as a critique of a state-run economy, but it's not a state-run economy. A state-controlled economy is not at all. There is small business. What there mainly is a kind of Amazon merged with the state that manages politically as well as economically the whole system. One of the things I mentioned in the book is how the Hunger Games competition itself echoes some of our punitive welfare systems. So there's this kind of scheme where you can apply for tokens for a bit more food rations, but that increases your chances of being selected as a contestant in the Hunger Games. So there's a very kind of conscious and deliberate punishment of the poor, and obviously that has a strong racial dimension to it as well.
And I think to talk about the contemporary American situation, I think that the racialization of poverty in the United States has done a great deal to insulate the system from a middle class recognition of collapse and the risk to itself from deindustrialization, ecological degradation, rising inequality. I remember when I was at Berkeley, there was already an inkling of how bad the labor market was going to be for academics when we graduated. But the attitude of especially people from, especially my classmates from kind of white, established, upper middle class American backgrounds was, well, you know, that threat, scarcity is not something that happens to us, right? And they didn't necessarily mean it in a racialized way, but we're Berkeley people, right? We're too good to be struggling, right? We inclusive, multicolored rainbow coalition of Berkeley elites, we're not going to be struggling for tenure. That's the Cal State problem. And I think that when many middle-class Americans, especially those that are used to economic security and are raised on meritocratic success across generations, poverty and risk are always seen as somebody else's problem, somebody else's story. The fact that it could happen to you is unimaginable because you've already normalized that it happens to someone different.
And yeah, and this is where we go back to the point about scarcity, whether it's real scarcity or an engineered scarcity. The system will, and we've already seen this. This is why I make the argument about recognizing that we're already living in collapse. When people get hungry, when they feel more insecure, that's more likely to lead to authoritarianism and totalitarianism than it is to some breakthrough for progressive or left movements, because it's obviously much easier for authoritarian populists to exploit that and to other certain groups, immigrants, people of color in particular, refugees, and to say, well, the problem is in scarcity. We can't afford anymore to support these people. We can't afford anymore to have these people here. They need to be contained. They need to be locked up. They need to be starved. And so I think we have a fundamental naivety still on the left about how the conditions we're now living in, and which are likely to get even worse, are much more likely to lead to the kind of regime, in some ways, that you see in popular culture stories like the Hunger Games, than they are to some kind of left breakthrough. And we, even though we talk a lot about authoritarian populism and so on, I don't think we really take that seriously enough still. And then how we're going to survive and organize in that kind of context.
Do you think America is living in its Weimar moment, pre-Nazi Germany moment?
I think that's what comes next. I think that's what comes next. You have a kind of artificial boom. I mean, people are already talking about, you know, a rerun of the Roaring '20s, and of course we know what happened after the Roaring '20s in the last century, and the fundamental reasons why you're going to have a Hunger Games scenario of scarcity and immiseration and then authoritarianism are things that are already locked into the system. It's climate change, it's broader ecological collapse, it's a crisis in the food production system, it's cities being underwater, it's pollution. It's all of those things which, even if we acted really seriously about them today, they are already locked into these natural systems. And so that's why I think we need to get ourselves into more of a survival mode than we do to continue kind of playing politics as if these things can be resolved with a Green New Deal, however important, programs like that are. And I just fundamentally don't think on the left we are there yet. We are in that mindset. And I think it has huge implications for what we think about, what we talk about, how we organize, more importantly, the things we think are important. I mean, we claim to understand crisis and collapse, right? Because we don't deny climate change, because we talk about crises of capitalism, but we haven't really, in the main, thought about what that means for our own politics, what that means for our own community. That there will be a state that we can take over, and in many ways there won't be, or at least there won't be in the way that we've thought about left politics for the last 50 years.
So now, Dr. Harris, what you're saying is that the notion of some kind of Keynesian new 2.0 reboot, say capitalism, or make it more socialist like, is a fantasy in your mind.
Yeah, it's over. It's over. Think about it this way: we have been approaching a 15-year crisis now. We've seen how elites respond to that in the way that they use huge amounts of public money to plow money towards existing corporations who get most of the bailout. We get these small checks if we're lucky. Now imagine successive waves of crisis, whether it's environmental or another virus or financial collapse over the next 10 to 15 years, and just extend the trends. There is a point where the state can't adopt a kind of emergency Keynesianism, as you say. That's just not possible. Other countries might find ways to do it, but I don't see countries like the US and the UK being able to do that.
We talked Dr. Harris a little bit because another guest that's coming on the live stream was on the audio podcast as well. Andres Malm actually writes about what Dr. Harris is talking about in Corona Climate and Chronic Emergency. That I think I agree with you. I think people are just kind of waiting for the Corona crisis to be over and everything's going to get back to normal. But there is a series of crises that is happening that we are not prepared for because capitalism can't protect us from this.
And I think that absolutely, not only did capitalism can't protect us from it, capitalism is the underlying cause of many of the phenomenon that are going to hit us most severely. And but I wanted to touch on something you said, and I know that I'm constantly harping back to the global versus American dichotomy, but when you describe the left needing to prepare for what the reality of collapse looks like, and adjusting its politics and adjusting its expectations, one thing that occurred to me reading towards the end of your book, when you describe kind of mutual aid, moving away from hierarchical authoritarian structures towards interpersonal ethic of solidarity, a kind of leftist solidarity on a civic or municipal or local scale being the kind of building block for a survival economy in a post-collapse scenario. It seems as though you've got different local and regional contexts to which leftist politics needs to adjust. And a lot depends on what happens everywhere else. So if a few advanced industrial, technologically sophisticated states can survive and muddle through with a Keynesian Green New Deal, while other places collapse, and rather than creating, the Fourth Reich, the Fifth Reich, the N+1 Reich. You have post state failure collectives and other solidaristic types of organization. That's a very different world than one where either everything goes under, or the only states that survive are the neo-fascist ones based on exclusion and domination. And it feels as though a heterogeneous strategy, like the left needs to preserve what it can, where it can, and where the writing is already on the wall, think about what it does when the time comes, and when politics are no longer about operating inside the framework of a nation state.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot in there, obviously, and other people should chime in. But in a way, the political sorting. Okay, so here's one way to look at it: the political sorting that you see, particularly going on in the United States at the moment, is already a kind of example of that, right? In the way that liberals and progressives, more than they ever have, are moving to certain areas, and so we're kind of almost creating in slow motion this future that's been predicted in lots of sci-fi, I think for a reason, for a long time, which is this kind of city-state future, where countries like the United States splinter, possibly as a result of future civil wars or oncoming civil wars, into these kind of different city states, and take very different directions into the future as well. And some of those cope much better with that future, and obviously some of them struggle a lot. And part of that, we talked earlier about technology. There was someone in the chat who referenced accelerate, which I presume they mean kind of left acceleration, and the idea of using technology beyond, in a kind of post-capitalism way, to really not only provide for the wants and needs that everybody has, but also resolve issues like climate change. The major civilizational problem we have is that technology is part of the cause. Under industrial capitalism, technology has helped to create some of these crises that we face. And so I'm increasingly critical of a kind of left accelerationist perspective that says that in a post-capitalist society, we can just use these technologies to create a kind of luxury communism. I just don't see how that's practical in a situation of ongoing crisis and collapse.
There's a comment.
Even if you could get a political coalition together behind that, the kind of economic and environmental forces we face will make that extremely difficult.
There's a comment in the chat where someone is saying that people are more concerned about home values and lower taxes, no matter the collateral cost for society. There was an article that just came out in the Wall Street Journal. I always advise people to read, the business magazines, because there's not much of a spin on it, right? A partisan spin, if you will. So apparently there is a home development in Conroe, Texas, which is a suburb, and an entire building development. Instead of selling each unit, each house, like you do when you build a development, they rented it. The builders rented it. Once they got it rented, they sold the entire tract for, I think it was like 39 million or whatever it was. I forget the number. Selling it as a whole was more profitable for the builder than it was to sell individually. So now you have these major companies that got all this pretty much interest-free money during the first CARES Act. And this is also very reminiscent of 2009, 2010, when we have all these corporations coming in, buying venture capital buying whole neighborhoods that were in foreclosure from these banks that went underwater. And now people have to compete with standing capital. Regular people trying to buy a house, you have to literally compete now with builders. So another story in Business Insider talked about a home that was for sale in, I want to say somewhere in like the Central Valley of California, $400,000 house in a suburb, which is, you know, pretty, it's a whatever house out here in California. And 122 offers were on it in 2 days.
Yeah, you could either sell all of those plots individually, but then you're chasing after peasant money. But if you combine them all, you can sell them as a village, as a collective, right? Like the labor comes with the real estate. And then you're looking at, you know, magnates, lord, aristocrat, landlord money, right? Like it makes perfect economic sense once the economy gets to this level of inequality, right? Like why chase nickels, you know, trying to sell to people who work for a living when you know for a fact that the entire, you know, all the juice is at the top. And
then we move back to feudalism.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think that Dr. Harris mentioned post-capital society, but we may end up with post-societal capitalism instead.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
mm-hmm.
I think that's a really neat way of putting it, and I think that's what is depicted in the Hunger Games is a kind of managed, monopolized, authoritarian capitalism. And I think you know, one of my critiques of the left is we still, in some ways, we still talk about capitalism and critique it on neoliberal terms. So we talk about competition and markets and consumerism and so on, but that's not the future of capitalism, and it's not increasingly the capitalism we're living in. And in the sense, it never was from the neoliberal project. It was always about monopolization, and it was always about containment and control, and it was never about the things that they said it was about. You know, freedom, competition, markets, autonomy, individualism, and so on. And we're still stuck in a kind of conversation as if we're talking to Milton Friedman in the 1970s, you know, and saying, well, hold on, your system, you know, competition is a bad thing. That's not the future we're heading towards in Crisis and Collapse. But our ideological critique hasn't caught up with that in the main, I don't think.
It's funny. People are just now coming in. They're saying like, "Oh, damn! I just got in the show and you guys are spooking me out about this shit." What's fascinating to me is another statistic in the Wall Street Journal piece was that there's more and more venture capital firms buying single-family homes. I'm going to repeat that again. It's more and more venture capital firms buying single-family homes, not apartment buildings, but single-family homes in the suburbs. After the housing crash, there was a change to go from suburban living. So if you guys are old enough to remember, all the build outs were in the suburbs. Kuba, I think we were going to school out here at the time. That's how I knew to kind of get out of the business, because it was getting insane when I'm seeing $800,000 gated communities being built in places like Tracy, California. And of course, all those things lost value as soon as everybody cried bankruptcy and these loans were underperforming. And
yeah,
and then the move turned to urban living, right? People want to live in the cities that they work in, so then you get urban lofts every fucking where. I was in Fargo, North Dakota, where someone tried to sell me a $4 fucking artisanal popsicle next to the urban don't you want to live downtown lofts that look like every other urban don't you want to live downtown lofts. Now we're looking at people moving out of these places back to the suburbs.
And each time,
go ahead.
And each cycle, the wealth gets more and more concentrated, and the buyers, the people looking for homes, the people in need of housing, have fewer and fewer resources. It's a shakedown each time. And a lot of that has to do with the way that bailouts and responses to financial disasters, financial crises are structured. If you're, and it's interesting to see that there's diversity in how different countries deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
In the United States, after Lehman Brothers, none of the peak financial institutions were allowed to go bankrupt. They were all made whole. They were all bailed out, whether through some kind of government brokered deal or just through cash being shoved to them across the table. In Iceland, which also had an insane real estate bubble and a financial system corrupt to the core that was busily cheating institutional investors in the UK and Icelandic homeowners, and that was their business model. It took a socialist to do this, but they took the radical step of actually letting a bank go bankrupt, right? They actually enforced the nominal rules of the market and allowed these fraudulent and insolvent financial institutions to collapse. And rather than perpetuating the previous system, you end up with a real hit to the nominal Icelandic economy. The currency drops precipitously, I think between 20 and 40%. But that spreads the pain and spreads the cost of the adjustment, the post-crisis adjustment across the entire society without corrupting the economic institutions. In fact, it reestablishes the rule of law, reasserts the rule of law over economic actors, and it prevents the concentration of more wealth at the top through an American-style peak bailout. And if you have an Icelandic solution, then you don't need to necessarily wait for the next real estate crisis to happen 10 years down the road. You actually have a much more durable solution. While in the United States, if you never deal with the underlying kind of casino and con man business model of peak financial institutions, well, at a certain point, they actually stop being grifters and are now full-on robber barons, right? They're buying your town, right? Like
Literally.
they stole your dad's pension and then they used it to buy your entire life.
Or you're seeing this proposal that we're seeing in the state of Nevada, and Dr. Harris, I don't know if you saw this. There was a proposal by the governor of Nevada to pretty much let tech companies come in. You saw that?
Yeah, there it is. There's the future.
And that to me,
corporate city states
is my fear, and we have hit in our hour. There's links in the chat, and I saw the LME already pre-ordered your book, Stay Alive, Surviving Capitalism's Hunger Games. Dr. Harris, do you have any more time you can share with us?
Of course. Always happy to.
Okay, you said nothing but a word. And for the bonus half, if you're a patron, we're going to talk about his first book, which uses Star Wars. And you're looking at 4 Star Wars fans on the screen as a grand narrative for the left. It's called Welcome to the Rebellion. And we're going to talk about Star Wars. We're going to talk about Welcome to the Rebellion. We might talk a little bit about Marvel. Not too much, maybe just a tad. And where I'm shocked this conversation stayed as serious as it did, I really am shocked. I'm not gonna lie. Considering what me and Pascal have been through earlier this morning, I thought it was going to be a little more silly. I'm going to have to. Whoever said Wakanda Forever is crazy. Whoever said that shit is a goddamn fool.
I'm with them. I'm with them.
We're going to talk about all this fun shit. And as you know, the chat is actually posted on the screen. So we respond a lot more to the shit you guys say. They can't see you guys. So Any parting words for the main show, Dr. Harris?
The book is out in the US on International Workers' Day, 1st of May. So please have a look at it if you're interested.
Great book. Made me watch a movie that I had no intention on watching. There was definitely a conversation in the chat about Battle Royale being a better movie. I loved Battle Royale. I've seen it too many times to count. Didn't like the sequel, but love Battle Royale. Kuba, have you seen Battle Royale?
Oh, you bet. Yeah.
Pascal, have you seen Battle Royale?
No, I've not.
You mean the movie or do you mean the battle?
The film. I wanted to do a clip of the movie as we were going out, but I'm just so afraid of getting pulled. Recently, we did an interview with Brian Mayer of Brazil Wire, where I just got a copyright infringement on my own song. They literally told me that I used my own song, and I might be violating my copyright by using my song. So a little pissed off at that.
Like, do you own your own song?
I own my own song. I own it.
But no offense, you don't look like a song owner. So it's very understandable, right? They're just.
I thought
you
it
have
was
to protect the property holder.
You want to know the funnier part of it? It's 30 seconds of a song because we had an issue. So I put 30 seconds of a song in, and I was like, this isn't going to be a problem. And I get hit because it's my own fucking song that I literally recorded everything on. And they said, oh yeah, well, you have a problem. So that was funny yet irritating. So when I disappeared for a while, I was literally disputing the copyright infringement claim. So I'm afraid to put anything Hunger Games related up because God forbid, who produced that? Fox, Paramount,
whoever it is, they have good lawyers.
Yeah, that's the last thing I want. Last time I got in trouble like that, I was selling bootleg copies of Revenge of the Sith. Thank you guys for checking this out. There's links in the chat wherever you're watching this to pre-order Dr. Michael Harris's book that I've read. I really enjoyed it. I love the way he writes. He writes in like a series of essays, so it's an easy read. If you're fans of the movies, and you'll really like it because, like, again, no one uses pop culture as an analogy better than Dr. Harris. So thank you guys, and we are